Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining today's web conference, FY 2019 First Wednesday Learning Series. Please note that all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the conference. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during the Q&A. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. With that, I'll turn the call over to Chris Eischen. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Kyle. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th session of SBA's First Wednesday webinar series for fiscal year 2019. Did you know that more than half of Americans either own or work for a small business and that they create about 2 out of every 3 new jobs in the U.S. each year? Well, every year since 1963, the President of the United States has issued a proclamation announcing National Small Business Week, which recognizes the critical contributions of Americans, entrepreneurs, and small business owners. In an effort to recognize these top small businesses, entrepreneurs, small business advocates, and champions, the U.S. Small Business Administration hosts the National Small Business Week. This year, the annual event is being held from May 5th through the 11th. As part of National Small Business Week, the SBA takes the opportunity to highlight the impact of outstanding entrepreneurs, small business owners, and others from all 50 states and U.S. territories. Every day, they're working to grow small businesses, create 21st century jobs, drive innovation, and increase America's global competitiveness. For more information on the 2019 National Small Business Week, please visit www.sba.gov/NSBW. Now on to slide 2. For today's session, we will be focusing on joint ventures, and by the end of this program, you should have a better understanding of this topic, as well as the resources available to you. If you are new to our event, this is a webinar series that focuses on getting subject matter experts on specific small business topics, such as joint ventures, and having them provide you with valuable information you can use in the performance of your job. We appreciate you taking the time to participate in the FY19 program, and we hope that you benefit from today's session. Now for a little background on the First Wednesday program. The program was initially created for contracting staff, which is why the training was called 1102 First Wednesday. The 1102 designated government series for contracting personnel was later dropped to be more inclusive of other GS series as federal agencies increased the requirements for non-1102s to obtain DIWEA or FACC certifications. Additionally, other federal buying activities, SBA staff, PTAC, and SBDC personnel who, after hearing about this training, requested access and were added to the list of participants. So that is why SBA's First Wednesday program is aimed at federal government employees and other resource partners like PTACs and SBDCs. Thank you to those of you who are repeat attendees, and welcome to those who are new to the program. On to slide 3. As Kyle mentioned, I am Chris Eischen, and I work as a Procurement Center Representative, or PCR, in Kansas City, Missouri. This slide also has Gwen Davis's information. Unfortunately, she is at an outreach event today, so I, too, will be reading the questions submitted during the program, and our speakers will address those at the end of today's session. And we both work in contracting, government contracting area 4, and slide 3 includes our information. On to slide 4. Please note that all lines are on mute. However, you may submit questions or technical issues in the chat box on your screen. Your questions may be submitted anytime during today's session by entering them into the chat box, and these questions will be addressed at the end of our speaker's presentation. To make sure your question doesn't get overlooked, please ensure it is addressed to all panelists on the drop-down and not just to one individual. As most of you know, we have transitioned to WebEx and have been informed that some users may experience issues such as a blocked website or other error messages when attempting to access the conference login from their computer. If you are affected by this issue, please make sure you dial in and follow along with the slides provided in this email. We will ensure the page numbers are clearly stated so you can follow along. We are hopeful this issue will be resolved soon, and we apologize for any inconvenience. Now, if you are having any other technical issues, please call the AT&T support desk at the following number, 1-888-796-6118. This telephone number is also included in the email invitation for today's program and on slide 4 of the PowerPoint presentation. Otherwise, just keep listening in and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation. For more SBA Small Business Program training and additional resources, please visit the SBA Learning Center at www.sba.gov. Slide 5. Did you know that the Association of Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, or APTAC, hosts a website where they post the First Wednesday programs? Since these sessions are being recorded, you can re-listen to this program as well as previous sessions by visiting their website, which is provided here on slide 5. Additionally, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, or PTACs, are a great resource, and partnering with your local PTAC for an industry day, sharing RFI notices or a source of thought announcement, or referring small business concerns to a PTAC are just a few reasons why they are such a useful resource for acquisition personnel. Please contact your local PTAC for additional information. Slide 6 is the program schedule for fiscal year 2019, and today's session on joint ventures is the 8th topic in the series. You will see that we have added a couple new topics to our program list and improved on other topics that we have presented in the past. You may see a slight change in the order of upcoming topics. However, the email invitation for the next session will be sent out in a few weeks, so please keep a lookout for this information. On slide 7, I'm sure that many of you will want to receive credit for today's training, so you'll be glad to know that today's session is worth 1 CLP. On the following slide, which is slide 8, you will find the training certificate, and I will go over the instructions at that time. Several of you may have received the information for this training from a friend or colleague, but if you want to receive an email directly from us notifying you of upcoming First Wednesday webinar events, just email us at sbalearning@sba.gov. That is SBALEARNING@sba.gov. In the subject line, please enter the words "Add to List," and we'll ensure you're added to the distribution list. On slide 8, you'll see the certificate. First, you'll need to access the PowerPoint presentation that was part of the SBA email invitation you received for today's session. Then, go to slide 8. You will manually fill in your name where it states, "Insert your name here." Next, within the print settings, you will select Print Current Slide, which will allow for only the certificate to be printed. Once this is done, you can coordinate the CLP achievement through your training program or coordinator. Please note that SBA does not track your CLPs or communicate with your training program coordinator regarding your CLP achievements. On to slide 9. Today's training has been assembled to address joint ventures, as well as provide you with additional resources available for your use. Our speakers have graciously accepted our invitation, and they will be directing me to continue on to the next slide. As mentioned earlier, if you are unable to access WebEx, please follow along with the PowerPoint presentation that was included in the email for today's training. We will identify the page numbers so you can follow along. Also, please note that some viewers may experience a delay as the slide changes on your screen. Now, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers to you, Ms. Valerie Coleman, who is the Prime Contracts Program Manager for SBA's Office of Government Contracting, and Ms. Esmeralda Sanchez, who is SBA's Size Program Manager in Area 6. We appreciate that both of you can meet with us today, and I'll turn the program over to you now.
This is Valerie. Thank you, Chris. In November, we did a webinar on size, and we were going to follow up in January with the topic on joint ventures and affiliation because we've gotten a lot of questions about that. But then a little thing called the furlough happened, and we have to change up some schedules. So Esmeralda and I are very pleased that we get to present this topic to you today. We should be on slide 10, and these are the topics that we're going to be talking about today on why small businesses do joint ventures, and then really get into the need of size and affiliation when dealing with JVs. And then we will also talk about the all-small mentor protege versus the 8A program, and then what parts of a JV should you be looking at as a contracting officer to make sure that you've got a very good and valid and complete joint venture. And then we will talk about protests. Next slide. So let's talk about the policy of the government. we all want to do maximum practicable opportunity to small businesses. And so that includes your small business, your small disadvantaged business, and a subset of SDB is the 8A program. HubZone small business, woman-owned, and a subset of woman-owned would be your EDWOBs, or economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, veteran, and a subset of that service disabled vet. Next slide.
Slide 12.
So what is a fair proportion? Of course, we have the small business goal of 23%, and then SDB, which does include 8A of 5, women, which includes EDWOBs of 5, HubZone 3, and service disabled vets of 3. There is no formal statutory goal for veteran-owned small business. There is one in subcontracting, but not in prime contracting. Next slide.
Slide 13.
So why joint venture? Contracts are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and so to maintain competition and to allow small businesses to compete, we encourage joint venturing. You know, they have a prime subcontractor relationship a lot of times, but a joint venture sometimes will help small businesses when they combine their efforts, their equipment, their financial capacity, things of that nature. And so we always want to encourage a joint venture if it's something that both parties are more than 2 people. Sometimes do a joint venture if they all want to participate and it works well for them. Next slide. So what are the benefits to a small business? Well, the first thing is they're going to gain new capacity and expertise. Working with someone else who does not have the capability that they have to perform work will help to encourage them to grow and learn new things, gain that new capacity, so maybe later on down the road they will not need to joint venture. You know, we always encourage the small business when they're looking at a solicitation to look at their strengths, but also be very honest and upfront about what your weaknesses are, because you want to joint venture, if you're going to go that way, with another business that will complement those weaknesses and help you overcome them. It also combines your capabilities and your past performance that you may have. It does increase your bidding and your buying capacity. And one of the 2 things at the very end, you are sharing the risk. If you have a joint venture, the small business has to maintain or have ownership of at least 51%. They're not going to share 100% of the risk. They have the 51%. And it's on a short time frame. Normally what happens is when a contract expires, that joint venture expires also short time frame basis. Next slide.
Slide 15.
So what is the definition of a joint venture? We've given you the Code of Federal Regulation reference up there for you to look at. And I'm not going to read the slides because you guys know how to read. But the basic thing is, it combines the effort, it combines the money, the skill, and the knowledge, and it's not on a continuing or permanent basis. For the most part, it does restrict you to 3 specific awards over a 2-year period. Next slide.
Slide 16.
And here's some of the things that Esmeralda's going to talk about. It consists only of small businesses, with the exception of 8A and the All Small Mentor Protege Program. The joint venture still certifies that it is small, and it is subject to any regulations just like if it was a single small business. And the main thing on the joint venture is SBA, except for the 8A program, does not review joint ventures. It is reviewed by the contracting officer. So to get you started on the rest of affiliation and everything else, I'm going to turn it over to Esmeralda for her to talk to you more about size.
Next slide. Thank you. Thanks, Val. Well, first of all, we want to find out what is a small business. SBA defines a small business as an entity that is organized for profit, that is has a place of business in the U.S. By operating primarily in the U.S., or that by providing significant contribution to the U.S. economy by taxes or use of American products or labor. The entity may not exceed a small business size assigned to a size, well, to the procurement. Either the small business, the revenue size standard, or the employee base size standard. An entity may be small for one NAICS code, but it may be other than small for another. A business may have more than one NAICS code. However, it needs to identify a primary NAICS code, and it would essentially identify its size based on the size standards that have been applied to all of the industry codes. If you'll go to the next slide.
Slide 18.
Yes. SBA does have a table of size standards, which it publishes on the 13 CFR 121.201, in which it applies a different size standard to various industries. Now, the industries are applied either a revenue-based size standard or an employee-based size standard. A NAICS code or an industry does not have two size standards. It's either revenue or employee, not both. Next.
Slide 19.
Thank you. So SBA depends, well, the SBA size, the determination of size depends on the number of affiliates. And so what are affiliates? Affiliates are entities that are controlled by the same person or the same entity. We look at the different bases. For instance, we look at common ownership, management. We look at any identity of interest by close family members. We look at common investments by individuals or entities. We also look at whether an entity is dependent on another entity through contractual relationships. We might look at a newly organized concern when some former officers or key personnel in one entity then serve as officers or key personnel in another entity. We look at franchise and license agreements, and we also look at joint ventures. Next slide. So how does SBA calculate receipts? We typically look at the average of the 3-year average for the last completed fiscal year, 3 fiscal years. We use federal tax returns, and we will take the annual receipts for all affiliates and combine them to establish size. Now, some of you are aware of the Small Business Runway Extension Act of 2018. This proposed regulation will eventually change the calculation from the average of 3 completed fiscal years to the average of 5. However, this proposed regulation is undergoing its regulatory process. And so once this process is complete, SBA will will change its calculations. Until that regular process is complete, we will continue using the calculation based on 3 years. Next slide.
Slide 21.
SBA calculates the number of employees by counting all individuals employed on a full-time, part-time basis, or employees obtained through temporary employment agencies. We look back at 12 complete months prior to the date SBA determines size. We actually do a running average of the number of employees. And what we do look for is information from official pay records. And in some cases, we might ask for quarterly IRS Form 941 to make it easier to submit documentation. Next slide. There are typically two types of affiliation. General affiliation, which is typically the most common, is ongoing. It's basically an ongoing basis. It's determined by common ownership, management control, economic dependence, franchise agreements, etc. They apply to the company in all business transactions. There are instances in which we will find affiliation for the procurement at hand. In these instances, generally we look at non-manufacturer rule requirements and whether the requirements for joint ventures are completely met. Slide.
Slide 23.
SBA requires that joint ventures be in writing and registered in SAM. They must be organized for a specific and limited purpose. They may not be populated, which means they cannot have their own employees. SBA wants to know what entity is supplying their employees. And each joint venture may be awarded up to 3 contracts over a 2-year period. Anything beyond 3 may be determined to be ongoing affiliation. Next slide. As a general rule on joint ventures, JV partners in a procurement are always affiliated with respect to that procurement. There are exceptions to this rule. There are 2 main exceptions to this rule, and those exceptions are the following. A JV may participate as a small business if the JV partners are each small under the size standard of the NICS associated with the procurement. And 2, if the JV members are part of an approved mentor-protege relationship, then and the mentor-protege agreement and the JV meet certain requirements, the JV may be considered a small business for the procurement. Next slide.
Slide 25.
Next, I will provide a few examples on joint ventures and whether they may or may not be eligible for an exception to affiliation based on joint ventures. The first one would be an example of a joint venture between a firm A, that has average annual sales of $8 million, and firm B that also has an average annual sales or average revenues of $8 million. And this joint venture wants to compete as a small business for a procurement that has an assigned NICS code of, say, I'll just identify this one, 541620, which has an assigned size standard of $15 million. And a JV with combined receipts of $16 million compete as a small business JV for a set aside with a size standard of $15 million? Well, under the general rule, JV rule, which states that that JV members are affiliated with respect to that procurement, they would not be. They, with 16 million, they would exceed the size standard, the 15 million size standard. However, under the exception provided under 13 CFR 121-103H3-1, because each of the JV members has receipts that meet the 15 million size standard, they are eligible. This JV in particular is eligible for an exception to affiliation that is allowed to certain small businesses and certain JVs. Next slide. In this example, we're going to have the same NAICS code, the same size standard for the procurement, 15 million. A JV made up of Firm A with average receipt of 7 million and Firm B with average receipt of 8 million have a combined some combined receipts of 15 million. So in this case, under the general affiliation, JV affiliation rule, they would be eligible to compete as a small business. They do, their combined receipts meet the 15 million size standard. And so no exception would be needed. Next slide.
Slide 27.
In this example, we have the same size standard, same NAICS code, two firms. Firm A has average annual receipts of 2 million, and Firm B has average annual receipts of 15.5 million. Under the general joint venture rule, their combined receipts of 17.5 million would exceed the 15 million size standard assigned to the procurement. So they would be ineligible under that general rule. Then we can look at maybe perhaps some exceptions. Under the exception afforded under H3.1, Firm A would meet the size standard. However, Firm B has receipts that exceed the 15 million. So they would not be eligible for the exception, the first exception under H3.1. This JV would not be eligible to compete for this procurement unless they have they are part of an approved maître-protégé relationship, which Valerie will discuss a bit later, how and what is required of a JV to comply with this regulation. Next slide.
Slide 28.
In this case, again, the same size standards, same NAICS code. In this case, both entities are eligible to meet the size standard. And so under the general rule, they're affiliated, and they have a combined receipt of 26 million, but because each of them has receipts that meet the 15 million size standard, they would be eligible for the exception afforded under H3.1. Next slide. So a joint venture submitted by an SBA approved mentor and protege may bid on federal procurement as a small business if the protege is small. This is part of the second exception to affiliation for certain joint ventures. However, the business, well, first of all, the protege must be small, and SBA must approve the mentor protege before the offer. Also, the JV agreement must meet certain requirements under regulation as stated here, 13 CFR 125.9. If there is a protest, the JV agreement will need to meet the requirements established in this regulation. Next slide. For 8A procurements, a JV may compete as a small business if the protege is small and if the SBA has approved the MPA, the mentor protege agreement, and the joint venture agreement. And so Valerie's going to speak next to what should be in the joint venture agreement.
All right.
31.
Thanks, Esmeralda. So one of the things that she was mentioning is that if you're in a protest, the joint venture agreement must have certain sections to it. And as a contracting officer, you want to make sure that everything is covered under a joint venture. So with that, we'll go over some of the provisions that must be in a joint venture agreement when you see it. So the first thing is setting forth the purpose of the joint venture, and normally that's to bid on a specific solicitation. And so the first provision would say that ABC and XYZ are forming JKL to bid on solicitation number, whatever it is, for whatever the service is being provided and the location of where it's at. The next thing is the small business must be the managing venture in this and employee of this entity. And it's going to be, they're going to be the person responsible for the performance on the contract. We also have to have the ownership of the joint venture partners. Normally the small business, either singular or several small businesses are going to own at least 51% of the joint venture. And they also state in there the distribution of the profit and the losses. There also should be a special bank account. This is very important. And one of the things that I've always told small businesses is when you establish that special bank account, because when you go in to do a contract for the federal government as a joint venture, the money paid by the federal government is not going to go into the account of ABC. It's not going to go into the account of XYZ. It's going to be into the account of JKL, which is the joint venture that was formed for this. So there is a different bank account for the joint venture. And one of the things I've always suggested, and I think is now part of the provisions, is that there must be at least 2 signatures on the account. You're not worried about who's going to be putting money in the account, but both parties to the joint venture should both be fully aware of what money is going out. So I've always said that if there are 2 parties to the joint venture, then there should be 2 signatures, one from each party on any check that's written, so everyone is aware of the money that's flowing out of the special bank account. Next slide.
Val, we're getting some feedback that some other people can't hear you, so if you could get a little...
Okay.
That'd be awesome.
Yes.
Perfect. And
okay.
Slide 32 is what we're on.
All righty. So there has to be a provision listing all the equipment that each party is bringing into the joint venture, and then how you're going to distribute the equipment if you have to buy any. Let me give you a very simple example, is you're going into a job and during that you're allowed to buy 9 computers. Include 4 going to each one, but what happens to the 9th one? You can't chop it in half. So does one party say, I'll pay for the other one, or how is that going to work? So you need a schedule of the dollar amount. You also have to have a provision specifying the responsibilities of all the parties to the joint venture. And you also have to have a provision that obligates all the parties to the joint venture. Then also you have to have a provision for keeping the records, administration and financial records of the joint venture. You do have to keep it for a certain number of years after the end of the joint venture, so you need to have all of those, and you have to keep all of your records. Next slide, please. So you have a provision stating that financial statements will be submitted to SBA no later than 45 days after each operating quarter of a joint venture. We do monitor them under 8A and the All Small Mental Protege program. A provision for handling substitution or addition of co-venturers. Let's say they don't get along and you're going to have to bring somebody in. How do you do that? And definitely how to handle disputes and the termination of the joint venture. Both parties are still obligated to complete the federal contract, even though they get into a dispute. So how are you going to handle that? Does one buy the other person out on their section? How do they do that? Then just a couple of more. Next slide, please.
Slide 34.
So performance of work. So the basic understanding is that the small business partner to the joint venture must perform at least 40% of their work performed by the joint venture. So let's say that you have on limitations of subcontracting that you have to do 15%. So the joint venture has to do 15%, and the small business to the joint venture must do 40% of the 15%. And it has to be more than just administrative or managerial. It has to be something that's going to give them a lot of experience. And it has to be work done by the partners will be aggregate. And again, has to be at least 40% of the total done by the partners. So those are the basic provisions that need to be in a joint venture when you get it. So I'm going to turn it over to Esmeralda to talk about limitations on subcontracting, who to send information to on size, and then talk about protest.
Now slide 35.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, so the limitations on subcontracting. If the limitations of subcontracting are typically not size issues. However, when it comes to verifying the performance of work on a JV, SBA does ensure that the requirements are being met. The limitations on subcontracting, according to the FAR, are listed as services that the JV must perform 50% of the value of the contract with its own personnel, supplies, 50% of the cost of manufacturing, excluding the materials, and in contracts regarding general construction, they would need to perform 50% of the cost of the contract with their own employees, excluding materials. And in special trade construction, 25% of the cost of the contract would need to be done with the JV's own employees, excluding materials. Well, actually, since the JV is not populated, they would have to be done by the JV partners. However, many of you do know that the DOD has issued a DOD deviation. So for some procurements, for DOD procurements, SBA does apply the DOD deviation requirements, essentially, which limits the subcontracting amounts to 50% to subcontractors that are not similarly situated entities. That would be for services and also for supplies. So the JV or the prime contractor would not pay more than 50% of the amount to entities that are not similarly situated, excluding the cost of materials. So, however, not all civilian agencies use the limitations on subcontracting identified on the DOD deviation. And so until that change is made in the FAR, SBA will continue to treat them a bit differently as it regards size determinations. Next slide. SBA has 6 area offices in which protests should be forwarded. It really depends on the area office that services the entity that is being protested. So the area in which the headquarters of the company is located would be receiving the size protest referral. Next slide.
Slide 37.
So SBA has 15 business days to issue a formal determination. Typically, we do take 15 business days. Sometimes we do request extensions. And a contracting officer is to not make it's not supposed to or shall not make award for at least 15 business days, unless the contracting officer determines that an award must be made to protect the public interest. After 15 business days, if the SBA has not completed the size determination, the contracting officer can award the contract. However, the contracting officer must determine in writing that an immediate need to award the contract has been found. That there has to be a finding that an immediate need to award the contract, and that waiting would be disadvantageous to the government. Next slide. SBA does not perform advisory opinions, and so size protests cannot be used to vet potential awardees. Protests are always in connection with a procurement, a particular procurement, or i.e. the pending procurement. There is no database that SBA maintains that lists all the small businesses that are certified with SBA. SBA uses SAM just like the rest of the civilian agent or the civilian and DoD agencies. However, after an other than small business finding, we do inform the concern that their status as a small business needs to be updated on SAM. Premature protests are those that are received before the notification of the apparent successful offer. Those premature protests are dismissed, even if they are made by the contracting officer. And SBA does ask that if there is a GAO protest, that you let the area office know. Next slide.
Slide 39.
Thanks. Timeliness and specificity. The contracting officer must receive a protest within 5 business days. 5 business days after the notification of the apparent successful offer. The date of debriefing is not relevant. The 5-day period begins when the apparent successful offer is identified. A protest must be specific, must contain detailed evidence to support the allegation that the concern is not small. The protestor must have standing to the protest, or the protest will be dismissed. In other words, it must be an interested party. Next slide.
Slide 40.
If SBA finds that a protest is timely and specific, SBA will begin the site determination process and will notify all interested parties of a pending site determination. SBA, as I mentioned, SBA has 15 business days or working days to issue a decision, assuming there's no extension. Although we are, in our area, we are finding that most site determinations are being given extensions because of the sheer number of site protests coming in. The final copy of the site determination is ultimately sent by SBA to the protestor, the protest concern, and the contracting officer. Next.
That's slide 41. So now
Go ahead. So that ends the joint venture and the size section. And Chris, I think I jumped in too quick because you were getting ready to see if we had any questions that have come in.
I've got some questions ready for you guys if you're ready.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. So the first one will take us back to slide 16. I'll pop that one up here. Slide 16 states that a joint venture is reviewed by a contracting officer, not the SBA. What are the review criteria?
So the review criteria is what we were just talking about on the parts of a joint venture. Go through the joint venture and make sure that it's a fully complete joint venture, that these provisions are in there, and that it is totally complete. And you can get a template of a joint venture on the SBA website if you want to keep one of those in-house. So anytime you get a joint venture, you can go through it to make sure that what you're looking at and what is in the template match up.
And if I could add, also that the JV agreement has been altered to fit the procurement that is being sought out. You want to make sure that it's not that the JV is not too general, so that it doesn't meet the requirements under the regs.
Okay. And I believe you have answered this one, but it was addressed before, the examples. If a joint venture combined employee count exceeds the employee size for a small business in a specific NAICS code, does that cause the joint venture to be ineligible for a small business set-aside?
Yes, it would be other than small. The joint venture you're saying, correct?
Yes.
Yes, the joint venture would be other than small, unless they are eligible for an exception to affiliation based on those two on those two exceptions. Whether if both JVs are small, they may be eligible for exception number one, and exception number two would be that a mentor-protege relationship be in place, and that the protege be small, and that the mentor-protege agreement and the JV meet certain requirements.
Okay. And so this individual has two questions. Can you expand on the populated and unpopulated? I'm trying to think what slide that was from. Do you recall what they would be referring to?
So populated, SBA at one point allowed joint ventures to be populated, to have their own employees. Now they're unpopulated. They're not allowed to have their own employees. And and it's basically done so that SBA and, well, the government can make sure if the performance of work requirements are being met. So it basically means that a joint venture cannot have its own employees.
Okay. And then the second part is as well as formal and informal joint venture.
Well, informal joint ventures would be those joint ventures or partnerships in which a prime contractor might be using a subcontractor for certain work on the procurement, and so SBA might deem them to be joint ventures. So even though they have no joint venture agreement, perhaps the proposal is such that it raises questions as to whether they're a joint venture.
And Val, I think you touched on this one, but can you provide an example of how to figure the 40% requirement of a joint venture on a 15% subcontracting limit general construction contract?
So based on the current regulations that are in the FAR right now, it would be the same thing. Remember, the one thing I said was that a joint venture is under the same obligation to perform work and to do the same things that an individual small business would do. So if it's a small business joint venture, what we're saying is, since Chris mentioned the 15%, a small business in construction, in general construction, would have to do right now, if you weren't using the deviations, 15% of the labor incurred to do the work with their own force. So in this case, it would be 15% of the work would have to be done by. We would want 15% of the work to be done by the joint venture itself, which means two parties to it. However, since the small business is involved, we want the small business to do 40% of the 15. So that they would, and that can't be anything like it's just administrative or something like that. It has to be substantial.
Great. Next question is, how long should it take for SBA to review an 8A joint venture agreement?
Well, it has to go through the district office because everything on 8A is handled in the district office, so it goes through that. And then it has to go, I believe, I have not been in the 8A program for 18 years, so it depends on how long it's going to take the district to do what they need to do and get it up to Washington. I would say, to be on the safe side, if I look at that like I do the All Small Mentor Protege program right now, which we were told last week is basically taking 90 days, you always want to tell a business longer than shorter, just in case. So I would say that you would need to allow at least 60 to 90 days for that joint venture to be approved.
Okay. And this is follow-on basically to that question, too. Does the SBA review the joint venture agreement before the two entities are allowed to be approved for a Metro Protege?
Two entirely separate things. So we review the Mentor Protege agreement and approve that. The joint venture agreement, we do not. We do not look at that. That's why we provide a template to help both parties to the joint venture to make sure that the provisions that I mentioned and also the specific information that Esmeralda mentioned are in that joint venture when it's presented to the procuring activity.
Okay. And when you say the joint venture partners, does this mean that the payroll submitted must be employees of the new joint venture entity instead of the small businesses that make up the partnership?
No, it would be for the small businesses that make up the partnership, the JV.
Okay.
You remember Esmeralda said that we do not do populated joint ventures, so there would be no employees of the joint venture. It would be employees of each partner to the joint venture.
Correct. Okay, next question. Are there any other exclusions other than cost of materials that could be not considered for the limitations on subcontracting?
The way it currently reads, it's the labor incurred to do the work. However, under the new provisions, which talks about similarly situated entities, I believe it's on the total cost of the contract. And so depending on how your individual activity looked at it, if there's a deviation in what they put into it. But if you do look at 52.219.14 as it reads now, it is for the labor incurred to do the work.
Okay. So this question is related to joint ventures being awarded under the basic ordering agreements. Does the award of the BOA itself count as a contract against the 3 contracts that may be awarded to the joint venture in its lifetime?
I'm going to say that we need to get a legal opinion on that, Chris, and to see whether legally we're talking about a BOA being one award, or are we talking about the individual awards under the BOA being contracts. So if you can send us that, we can get our attorney to look at that and give us a legal opinion.
Okay. So does a joint venture have to include a small business, or can it be 2 other than small businesses?
Well, for small business procurement, yes, they would have to be small. Otherwise, they could, but it would not. It would not allow. They would not be allowed to get set-aside contracts for small businesses.
Got it. So this next one is in regards to past performance. How is past performance evaluation completed on a joint venture?
That is reviewed by the contracting officer. We don't typically review that unless it's part of, no, we don't actually, we don't review past performance.
So I think the question I think they're trying to get at is, are you looking at the prime, which firm, are you looking at the joint venture as a whole? Are they able to look at the joint venture as a whole, or do they look at the 2 separate contractors and their previous past performance?
I think that the way the ruling reads now is that they can look at the individual past performance of each party to the joint venture, but let me double check that.
Okay.
We do have an open FAR case right now dealing with joint ventures because there really hasn't been that much written, and so that may be part of the open FAR case right now.
Right. Okay, on to slide 23. Each joint venture may be awarded up to 3 contracts. Is there a limit on how many joint venture a member, say the individual businesses, may include?
SBA does not have any regulation that really limits the number of contracts or the number of JVs that can receive more than or less than 3 contracts or 3 or less in 2 years. However, SBA may look at the history of the 2 entities, and it may decide that may make a finding that the JV partners are generally affiliated based on their continued history, and they're having a long-standing relationship.
Okay, the next question is for an unpopulated joint venture. Are the joint venture managing partners the subcontractors of the joint venture? How is the prime and sub relationship defined for an unpopulated joint venture?
In a joint venture, the parties are not prime and sub to each other. See, a lot of people get the word teaming relationships mixed up. There's only 2 types of teaming relationships. There's a prime sub, and then there is a joint venture. So the joint venturers, the 2 parties to the joint ventures are not subcontractors of each other.
Yep.
Am I understanding the question correctly?
I think because, the definition is mainly, it goes back to the unpopulated joint venture, the definition of that. So I think you are.
Yeah, because on an unpopulated, each employee of each company stays their own employee. So each company will be doing their own work. So yeah, in that case, that would not be a prime subcontractor relationship.
Okay. So we've got another one on past performance. Specifically, who gets the credit when joint venture members decide to propose separately on a procurement?
So they were previous joint venture partners, or they had a joint venture, and now they're each going their own separate ways, and they're going to bid individually. That's
how I understand it, yes.
Okay. Again, that would be, as I said before, on the past performance issue. I don't know if the correct language would be, or the correct answer would be, we'll look at what each partner to the joint venture did as far as what they did in that solicitation or under that contract to determine past performance. That's part of I think, a subset of the question that I'm going to have to get legal to answer.
Okay. We've got a couple more for you. So can SBA override a joint venture pending award?
Can override meaning rewriting the joint venture? For size determination purposes, we determine whether the JV meets the requirements or not. We don't rewrite. We don't override. Sorry. I'm not too sure I'm understanding.
Well, are they asking, if they submit a joint venture, can SBA say, no, it's not correct? And as Esmeralda just said, if the federal agency, if they're the apparent awardee and for some reason the federal agency thinks there's affiliation or there's something else going on, of course they would send it in for a size determination. And in that case, as Esmeralda said, if our size specialist determined that it really was affiliated and it's not a small business joint venture, then we would say that is incorrect, that they couldn't bid because they are not small.
Okay.
I'm thinking that's what they're asking. I think that's what the basis of the question was.
Got it.
Thanks, Val.
Well, here's one that just came in. Does the contracting officer have privity with the joint venture members?
Privity with the joint venture members?
Yes.
In what way?
I don't know.
Could we expand, whoever wrote that question, could they expand on that?
Sure. And then here's the last one. If they're still on, if you could write in the comment, the chat box, if you could expand on that. We've got one example here, one more question that came in. So has there been any lessons learned, GAO case law, anything worth sharing concerning examples of the evaluation criteria or factors where the government overreached concerning joint ventures? For example, if corporate experience is an evaluation factor, then must government accept the joint venture's experience as acceptable if only partner 1 has it but partner 2 does not? That would mean that 50% of the work was performed by the joint venture of at least one of the partners.
Yeah.
And I think that goes exactly with what a previous one. So, would you agree?
That was a little in depth, right?
Yes, it was. Very descriptive.
Any of the questions that we're not able to answer, we'd be more than happy if you put them in writing. Esmeralda, did you want to respond?
Yes, I was just going to say I don't know any case law offhand. However, I could do some research and get back to you.
Okay. Well, we are over time, so I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Esmeralda and Val for the great presentation today and responding to the large number of questions that we did have. And as Val said, if you do have any questions after, please feel free to reach out to them directly. And I want to thank everyone for being on today's call, and we look forward to your participation in the months to come.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.